It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. But when a flight attendant slapped a young black girl in front of an entire cabin of stunned passengers, no one could have predicted what was about to unfold. Within minutes, the very same flight attendant would face consequences that could alter the course of her career and her life. What happens next? It's the kind of justice that stirs the soul. Before we dive into this powerful story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that will leave you inspired. It was a busy Thursday afternoon at Roswell International Airport. Maya Bennett, a poised and soft-spoken young woman in her early 20s, stepped onto Flight 4762 bound for Brighton City. Though she wasn't used to flying, Maya walked down the aisle with grace. Her mother, Vivian Bennett, had always reminded her to move through the world with dignity, especially when that world didn't always treat her fairly. Maya had been looking forward to this flight for weeks. It was the first time in years the extended family was gathering for a reunion, and her seat, 2A in the first class, was a small luxury made possible by her mother's tireless work and hard-won success. She slid into the plush leather seat quietly, gently tucking her purse beneath the seat in front of her, adjusting her small bag on her lap. The hum of activity around her grew louder, other passengers chatting, stowing luggage, finding their places. Maya stayed calm, folding her hands and glancing out the window as the aircraft filled. Yet something gnawed at her. She noticed it right away. A few glances here and there, curious stares that lingered a little too long. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. Maybe it was her natural curls, soft and free. Or perhaps it was the quiet confidence she carried. Whatever it was, it gave her the unmistakable feeling that someone, or maybe several someones, thought she didn't quite fit in. Still, Maya had learned not to give those looks any power. She straightened in her seat and reminded herself, "You deserve to be here." That was when Denise Warren, one of the flight attendants, began her walk through the first-class cabin. She moved with the kind of briskness that spoke of years on the job, not unkind, but clearly focused. Denise's eyes swept across the passengers until they landed on Maya. She paused, just for a second. But it was long enough for Maya to notice something shift. Denise didn't say a word. She simply looked at the seat number above Maya, then back at her. There was something judgmental in her gaze. Not overt, not loud, but unmistakable. Maya glanced away. Maybe the woman was just doing her job, or maybe not. Either way, she wasn't going to let it bother her, or so she told herself. Denise returned a few minutes later. Only this time the atmosphere had changed. There was no smile, no hint of politeness, just a stiff posture and tight-lipped professionalism. "Excuse me," Denise said, her voice clipped and formal. "May I see your boarding pass?" Maya blinked in surprise. "Of course," she replied, reaching calmly into her purse. She handed over the neatly folded pass with a polite smile. Denise took it, looked it over, and frowned. A long pause stretched between them. Then, finally, "This is for first class," she said flatly, her tone bordering on disbelief. "Yes, that's correct," Maya replied, still composed. Denise's eyes narrowed ever so slightly before she handed the ticket back without another word. She gave Maya one last look, lingering, almost measuring, and then walked away. Maya sat in silence, her heart picking up speed. She couldn't shake the feeling that something more was coming, and she was right. Moments later, Denise returned again, this time with zero pretense. "Miss," she said, her tone sharper now, There's been a mistake with your booking. I'm going to need you to move to a different seat." Maya's brows furrowed. "A mistake?" she repeated. "I don't think that's correct. My ticket is valid." Denise crossed her arms slightly. "I don't have time to explain. You need to move. If you refuse, I'll be forced to call security." The words hit like cold water. Maya felt her breath catch for just a second. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Stay calm, stay grounded, but never shrink yourself." She had done nothing wrong, nothing, and yet she was being treated like she didn't belong. Not in this seat, not in this cabin, maybe not even on this plane. With a slow, quiet breath, Maya nodded and began gathering her things. Each movement was deliberate. Every breath was a battle not to show the fire building in her chest. Around her, the whispers started. She could feel the eyes, the silence that follows scenes people don't want to acknowledge. She stood, back straight, face calm, but her fingers gripped her bag with just enough pressure to leave marks. The walk toward the rear of the plane felt longer than it was, and behind her, Denise didn't say a word. Maya walked slowly down the narrow aisle, the low hum of whispers rising behind her like a wave. Every step toward the back of the plane felt heavier than the last. Each glance from the other passengers a silent question, or worse, a judgment. Still, she held her head high, her grip tightening around the strap of her bag. She didn't stumble. She didn't cry. But her mind was spinning. By the time she reached her new seat in the economy section, Maya felt the sting of something deeper than inconvenience. Something that curled into her chest like smoke. She slipped into the narrow seat, barely noticing the harsh downgrade in comfort. Outside the window, the clouds moved peacefully. Inside, a storm brewed. Why had Denise Warren, the flight attendant, targeted her? Why was she forced to move without a real explanation? A vague mistake was all she had been offered. No one around her had said a word. And yet, Maya felt the weight of their eyes pressing into her back, like questions they were too afraid to ask out loud. But what no one in the cabin realized was that Vivian Bennett, Maya's mother, had been watching it all unfold just a few rows ahead in first class. Vivian had seen the exchange, had clocked every subtle shift in Maya's face, the way she held herself slightly more upright, the tiny crease between her brows. Vivian knew her daughter well. She recognized the quiet signs of distress, the practiced calm masking disappointment and hurt. And Vivian's heart sank. Not out of shock, but out of a weary familiarity. She'd been in this exact place before. Her own success, her presence in rooms where people didn't expect her, had often been questioned, picked apart, doubted. But Vivian wasn't the kind of woman who let things slide, especially not when it came to her daughter. She didn't react right away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't demand an explanation. Instead, she sat still, composed. She reached into her handbag and pulled out her phone, her fingers moving steadily. She began documenting every detail, every nuance of the encounter. She wouldn't make a scene. She would make impact. Because this wasn't going to end the way Denise thought it would. Vivian's fingers tapped rhythmically against the armrest, her eyes trained on the flight attendants moving up and down the aisle. She was calculating, observing. Her calm was deliberate, strategic, not a lack of emotion, but the discipline of someone who knew how to wait for the perfect moment to strike. Meanwhile, in her cramped seat, Maya sat in silence. The energy in the cabin had shifted, thick with tension. Most passengers kept their heads down, too polite or too afraid to intervene. A few cast quiet, sympathetic glances her way. Maya ignored them. She reached into her tote and pulled out a small notebook. The pen in her hand felt familiar, grounding. She started to write, her letters tidy and sharp. Her mind was a swirl of thoughts, each word on the page an attempt to make sense of what had just happened. What had she done wrong? Was it her skin? Her curls? Her quiet confidence that somehow made her seem out of place? She had seen this kind of thing before, not always in ways so public, but just as insidious. Still, it stung. She didn't let it show. Vivian had raised her to stay composed, to never give someone the satisfaction of seeing her shaken. But even so, Maya's hand began to tremble slightly. She took a slow breath and gripped the pen tighter. This wasn't over. She wasn't going to be reduced to silence. She wouldn't pretend this hadn't happened. She wouldn't let this moment define her, but she would use it. Across the plane, Denise tried to lose herself in her duties, handing out drinks, asking passengers about their preferences, forcing smiles. But her mind kept drifting. Back to Maya. Why hadn't the girl argued? Why hadn't she cried, raised her voice, demanded an explanation? There was something unsettling about Maya's stillness, about the way she had accepted the humiliation with such poise. It was as if she knew something Denise didn't. Denise tried to shake it off. She had just followed protocol, hadn't she? But something about the way Maya had looked at her, calm, steady, unshaken, made Denise uneasy. She glanced toward the back of the plane and caught a glimpse of Maya's profile. She was staring out the window, still as stone. Yet her presence was impossible to ignore. Her silence was louder than words. And sitting in first class, Vivian watched everything. She knew exactly what Maya was doing. Her daughter wasn't reacting out of emotion. She was preparing. Maya didn't flail when confronted. She planned, she processed, and Vivian trusted her. But that didn't mean she was going to sit back and do nothing. At the front of the plane, Denise couldn't stop the growing feeling in her stomach, the creeping sense that maybe she had miscalculated, that perhaps this wasn't just another passenger, and this wasn't going to be just another flight. She overheard the murmur of two attendants near the galley. One of them, an older woman with years of experience, lowered her voice. "You sure about what happened with that woman up front?" she asked. Denise stiffened. "She didn't belong in first class," she said quickly. "She didn't seem like the type." The older attendant gave her a long look, but said nothing, and in that silence the truth began to settle in. In the back of the galley, the quiet murmur of conversation broke through the noise of clinking ice and shuffling carts. Margot Lane, a seasoned flight attendant with decades of experience under her belt, shook her head slowly as she leaned toward Denise Warren. "Are you sure about what happened with that passenger?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Denise's brow furrowed. "She didn't belong in first class, Margot," she replied without hesitation. "She wasn't dressed like the others. She didn't act like them either." Margot raised an eyebrow and glanced discreetly down the aisle, then leaned in a little closer. "You need to be careful, Denise. People who sit up there, they don't like being questioned, especially by crew members who forget where the boundaries are." Denise stiffened. The words stung more than she expected. She'd heard that kind of talk before, the quiet warnings that certain passengers had more power than they let on, but it never felt like they applied to her. She was always in control, always the authority, but not today. Something about Maya Bennett, the young woman she had moved to economy, had unraveled that certainty. There was a quiet strength in Maya that made Denise feel off balance, like she'd missed something crucial, something that couldn't be undone. Not wanting to appear rattled, Denise offered a terse nod and returned to her duties. But the tension in her chest didn't ease. It grew. Something was wrong. And it wasn't just the decision to move Maya. It was everything. The silence, the confidence, the way Maya had carried herself even while being humiliated. Denise couldn't shake it. Meanwhile, in first class, Vivian Bennett remained perfectly composed in her seat, at least on the outside. But inside, she was already moving. The moment she saw her daughter being led away, Vivian had started putting things in motion. She made a few quiet calls from her seat, connecting with her executive assistant back at the Bennett Equity Group. She wasn't calling to complain. She was initiating a process. She needed a specific file, a policy report. She wanted names. She wanted procedures. She wasn't going to let this moment be swept under a rug. Her family's company had always operated under the highest standards of customer respect, and she expected nothing less from any organization she dealt with, especially this airline. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about the next young woman who might be treated the same way. Vivian knew. This wasn't an isolated mistake. It was a crack in a much bigger system, and cracks had to be exposed before they could be repaired. As she fired off a quick message on her phone, she made a mental note. The airline's internal policies would need a full review. And Denise? She wouldn't walk away from this without consequences. Not out of vengeance, but out of justice. This wasn't personal retribution. This was accountability. Vivian's phone buzzed softly, a message from her assistant. Everything was ready. A small, knowing smile played at the corners of her lips. This was the moment everything began to shift. At the back of the plane, Maya continued writing in her notebook, but this wasn't idle journaling. Each word she scribbled was deliberate. A reflection, a plan, a record. She knew her mother would take care of the situation, but she wasn't going to sit in silence. Maya wasn't passive. She never had been. She was preparing. She wrote with intention, her pen moving smoothly across the page as the clouds drifted past the window. There was something almost meditative in the process, something grounding, but there was also a subtle strength building in her expression, a quiet defiance that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. Vivian, a few rows ahead, caught a glimpse of her daughter and nodded slightly. Maya was ready, and so was she. She had already sent the email that would ignite a chain reaction. The first domino was down. Vivian wasn't going to let one moment of ignorance ruin what she and her daughter had built, and she certainly wasn't going to let the system continue unchecked. As the plane hummed steadily at cruising altitude, Denise was slowly unraveling. She tried to maintain her rhythm, greeting passengers, checking belts, pouring coffee, but she kept glancing toward the back. Every time her eyes landed on Maya, something inside her twisted. She had seen the way Maya stood her ground, not with anger, but with grace, with strength. And that scared her more than a confrontation ever could. What was Maya waiting for? Was there a complaint already filed? A call made? A connection she didn't know about? Denise didn't have the answers, but she was starting to realize just how deeply she had misread the situation. Back in first class, Vivian sat with her legs crossed, her phone now tucked away. She said nothing, made no announcement. She didn't need to. She was playing the long game. And as she stared quietly ahead, she could feel something else boiling just beneath her calm exterior. Something far more personal. It wasn't just about right and wrong. It was about how Maya had been looked at, about how she'd been assumed to not belong, about how she had been made to feel less than in front of a crowd of strangers just for sitting in a seat her family had paid for. Vivian had spent decades earning her place in the world and fighting for the space her daughter now occupied. She had sacrificed too much to let small-mindedness go unchallenged. And Maya, she wasn't going to let it slide either, because this time the world was about to learn who they were really dealing with. In the quiet rhythm of the cabin, Denise Warren tried to convince herself she'd done the right thing. After all, she'd always prided herself on being sharp, someone who could quickly size up a situation, someone who didn't tolerate disruptions, someone who followed the rules to the letter. She wasn't the type to question her instincts, but this time, her instincts had left her unsettled. She kept thinking about Maya Bennett, about how she had simply sat there, calm and composed, even as she was moved out of first class, about how she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't protested, hadn't crumbled. There was something in her eyes that stayed with Denise, something too quiet, too certain to ignore. Had she been wrong? Had she acted on bias instead of reason? Denise didn't want to admit it, but the thought gnawed at her. Back in economy, Maya stared out the window, her phone gripped loosely in her hand. Her posture was steady, her expression unreadable. But inside, she was waiting, not nervously, but with assurance. She had already made the call. Her mother, Vivian, had already moved, and when Vivian acted, change followed. This wasn't over. Maya didn't need to argue her place. She didn't need to reclaim the seat she paid for, because she understood now. The real seat she held was the one that gave her a voice, and that voice was already echoing far beyond the cabin walls. Back in the galley, Denise's anxiety was starting to show. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, a nervous twitch she couldn't suppress. Her fellow crew members noticed. And finally, Margot Lane, the most experienced flight attendant on board, approached. "You all right?" Margot asked quietly, concern lining her voice. "You seem off." Denise forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a little distracted, that's all." But Margot wasn't buying it. She had seen enough tense flights to recognize when a colleague was unraveling. She leaned in, lowering her voice further. "Is this about the young woman you moved to economy?" Denise's expression hardened, though a flicker of uncertainty flashed in her eyes. "I don't know. Something feels off," she admitted. Margot tilted her head. She didn't belong in first class? She didn't look like she could afford it. Denise snapped back before she could stop herself. Margot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Did you ask her? Or did you just assume?" For a moment, Denise had no reply. The words struck deeper than she expected. In her mind, it had made sense at the time, a gut feeling. But now, looking back, she realized she hadn't given Maya a chance to speak. She hadn't asked questions. She had made a call based on what felt right, but maybe what felt right was deeply, deeply wrong. "That's not like you, Denise," Margot added gently but firmly. "You're better than assumptions." "I'm sure I did the right thing," Denise muttered, her voice flat, unconvincing. Margot didn't respond, just gave a slow nod. "You better hope so," she said. "First-class passengers don't take lightly to being moved, especially without reason. You may want to check again before this gets out of hand." Denise turned away, trying to shake the unease, but her stomach churned. It was too late to unmake the moment, and she could feel its weight growing heavier with every breath. In first class, Vivian's phone buzzed softly in her hand. She glanced at the message and gave a quiet nod to herself. Her assistant had confirmed. The complaint had been submitted to the airline's executive team, along with a detailed report. Internal review protocols were being triggered. The wheel was turning now, and there was no stopping it. Vivian allowed herself a small breath. She wasn't seeking retribution. She was setting a precedent. If her daughter had to go through this, it would mean something. This wasn't just about fixing an incident. It was about fixing the system. In economy, Maya felt the atmosphere thicken. The pressure in the cabin wasn't just from altitude. It was the tension of power shifting hands. Not loudly, but quietly, strategically. She had always known her mother was powerful, but watching how swiftly Vivian moved behind the scenes, how she coordinated without a single raised voice, was a different kind of education. This was the kind of power that didn't bark. It moved mountains. Vivian wasn't just acting as a mother, she was acting as a leader. And Maya knew that from this moment forward, nothing about this flight would be forgotten. Back in the aisle, Denise passed by Maya's row again. Their eyes met for just a second, and in that second, Denise felt it. That same unsettling calm, that same quiet confidence that made her feel suddenly small, like she had grossly miscalculated who she was dealing with. The plane began its descent, but for Denise, the descent had already started long before the wheels hit the ground. Her mind wasn't on landing instructions or safety checks or disembarkation protocol. It was replaying the moment she asked Maya to move, the expression on her face, the silence in response, and the thought, had I just made a mistake that can't be undone? As the cabin filled with pre-landing chatter, one thing became clear. This flight had changed course, and Denise wasn't ready for the landing. The unease had grown into something undeniable, a knot in Denise Warren's stomach that wouldn't loosen. Her movements were stiff now, robotic. She moved through the aisles, offering drinks with a mechanical smile, assisting passengers almost on autopilot. But her mind, it was spinning out of control. Each time she passed Maya Bennett's row, she could feel it, that presence. Maya was still, silent. Her eyes flicked to her watch now and then, but otherwise she didn't move much. It was as if everything had already been decided, as if she were simply waiting for the final act of a performance she had already predicted. And Denise? She felt like the one being watched now. Every time their eyes met, even briefly, Denise felt exposed, as if Maya could see right through her. Her own authority, once so secure, suddenly felt flimsy, fragile. There was no anger in Maya's eyes, no rage or spite, just calm. But it was a calm that unnerved Denise more than any confrontation ever could. It was knowing, and it made Denise feel small. She tried to focus, to regain control, but nothing felt right anymore. Questions rolled over her like waves. Why had she been so sure Maya didn't belong? Why had she assumed? Why was it all crumbling now? Denise passed Maya's row again. Maya's gaze lifted, locking with hers for just a moment. And in that moment, Denise felt something shift deep inside her. The look wasn't cruel. It wasn't smug. It was calm, but firm. And it chilled her. Because for the first time in her entire career, Denise wasn't sure she'd had the right to do what she'd done. She had made a call, and she was about to find out just how costly it was. At the front of the plane, Vivian Bennett remained still, phone in hand, her eyes watching everything with quiet calculation. She had made a few discreet phone calls during the flight, coordinating with her team back at Bennett Equity Group. Her attention was calm, but razor sharp. Everything was unfolding exactly as she had anticipated. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She had already moved the necessary pieces. And now she was just waiting for the landing, because that's when the real work would begin. Back in the galley, Denise froze as the intercom buzzed overhead, signaling the final approach. She should have been focused on safety checks, passenger needs, but her mind was elsewhere. The weight of what she'd done was sinking in. She had acted impulsively, without asking questions. She had relied on assumptions instead of facts. And now she couldn't stop the rising panic tightening her chest. Then the galley phone rang. She hesitated, then picked it up, trying to steady her hand. "This is Denise," she said quietly. A pause. Then came a voice. Calm, professional, and unmistakably serious. "Denise, this is the executive office. We need a detailed report on the incident with the first-class passenger. A complaint has been filed, and we need your account as soon as the plane lands." The words landed like a blow. Denise's breath caught. "A complaint?" she repeated, her voice almost inaudible. "Yes," the voice confirmed. "A formal report about how you handled Miss Bennett's seating situation. Please ensure all passengers are treated with full courtesy for the remainder of the flight. No further seating changes without executive approval. Understood?" Denise's face flushed hot. Miss Bennett. That name, Bennett, echoed in her head like a warning bell. And then it hit her. Maya Bennett. She hadn't just moved any passenger. She had moved the daughter of Vivian Bennett, one of the most influential businesswomen in the country, a major stakeholder in countless corporate boards, including this very airline. Denise's knees felt weak. Her chest tightened. Her eyes darted to first class, where Vivian had been seated the entire flight, silent, composed, and clearly observing every second of the incident. How had she not realized it? How could she have missed that? This wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a catastrophic mistake. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hung up the phone, her mind spiraling with dread. This wasn't just about being written up. This wasn't about a minor complaint. She had publicly humiliated someone whose family had the power to change the course of her entire career. And they had watched her do it, in silence. Denise's mind reeled as she stumbled back into the aisle, the final minutes of the flight stretching out like hours. She had assumed, and now she would face everything that came with that assumption. It was the kind of mistake that could end a career. And Denise Warren knew it. She stood stiffly near the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to maintain some semblance of professionalism. But inside, panic was creeping up her spine like ice water. She had no idea what Vivian Bennett would do next, but every instinct told her it wouldn't be quiet, and it wouldn't be small. Vivian had seen this kind of injustice before. She had spent years walking into rooms where people underestimated her, dismissed her, and got away with it, until they didn't. This time, though, it was different. Now she had the power, the position, and the presence to demand change and get it. And this time, it was personal. She wasn't just protecting her brand, her board seat, or her influence. She was protecting her daughter. Vivian's phone buzzed in her lap. She glanced down and smiled faintly at the message from her assistant. Everything was in motion. The timing was right. The language was precise. There was no need to storm the cockpit or create a scene. The storm was already coming, and it was corporate. She wasn't here to get an apology from one flight attendant. She was here to change an airline. As the plane began its descent into Brighton Regional Airport, Denise clutched the back of a seat to steady herself. Her stomach churned. She couldn't stop replaying the decision she'd made. The quiet confidence in Maya's eyes, the unmistakable look in Vivian's. This wasn't going to be brushed under the rug. The aircraft touched down smoothly, but for Denise, it felt like free fall. As passengers began to unbuckle and stretch, chatting about baggage and ride shares, Denise's mind wasn't on landing announcements. Her thoughts were consumed by one thing. What happens now? She stood at the front of the cabin, forcing a smile, trying to greet passengers with the same practiced friendliness she had shown at takeoff. But now, it was hollow. Her voice lacked conviction. Her eyes kept flicking to the rear of first class, to Maya Bennett, who remained in her seat, poised, still, not rushing. Maya didn't have to rush. She already knew she had taken control of the situation. Vivian had made sure of that. Every necessary message had been sent. Every protocol triggered. The ripple was spreading, and soon it would be a wave. Denise tried to keep her composure as the passengers began filing past her. She offered mechanical goodbyes and tight smiles, but her heart sank every time her eyes caught Maya, still seated, still calm, as if she were the one deciding when the flight ended. And in a way, she was, because nothing about this flight was over. Not yet. As the line thinned and only a few passengers remained, Vivian Bennett stood, gathering her things with careful elegance. She was among the last to disembark, not because she was slow, but because she chose to be. When she reached the front of the cabin, she paused just briefly, her eyes locking with Denise's. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. Cool, unwavering, calculated. It wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was something far more powerful. Certainty. And that certainty made Denise's throat tighten. She forced a tight smile, barely able to breathe. Then Vivian walked off the plane. The moment Denise stepped through the aircraft door a few minutes later, her heart sank. 2 uniformed security officers stood just beyond the jet bridge, waiting. Their expressions were unreadable. They didn't have to say much. Denise already knew what this was. This wasn't just fallout. This was escalation. One of the officers stepped forward. "Are you Denise Warren?" he asked, his voice low and firm. Her mouth went dry. "Yes," she said, barely above a whisper. "We need you to come with us," the officer said. "We have questions about an incident involving a first-class passenger." Denise's legs nearly gave out. She had expected consequences, a reprimand, maybe a disciplinary note. But this was something else entirely. As they led her down the corridor, her thoughts spiraled. What had she said exactly? How had she misjudged things so badly? Why hadn't she stopped to think before acting? She had let instinct rule her, and now she was facing the reality of what that instinct had cost her, because this wasn't just about a seat assignment. This was about who she had judged, and who had been watching. The pace of everything had quickened. Denise Warren barely had time to process what was happening as the 2 officers flanked her and escorted her down the terminal corridor. Her footsteps echoed hollowly against the tile as her thoughts spiraled out of control. This wasn't a standard follow-up. This wasn't a simple passenger complaint. Whoever had filed it had power. Real power. Her heart thudded against her ribs as she mentally retraced every step of the flight. Every word she'd spoken. Every look she'd given. Had she said something that crossed the line? Had she allowed her own bias to cloud her judgment? The answer was already clear. painfully, irrevocably clear. She had acted on assumption, and now there was no undoing what had been done. Meanwhile, at Brighton Regional Airport's baggage claim, Maya Bennett stood quietly amidst the noise. Travelers bustled around her, dragging suitcases, calling ride shares, hurrying off to connections. But none of it fazed her. Her calm was unwavering. Her mother was handling the system. And Maya? She was already focused on what came next. This wasn't about Denise anymore. This had evolved beyond one flight attendant's mistake. This was about the broader issue, the deep, insidious current of bias that ran through the airline's culture. Vivian Bennett had seen it, and now she was making sure the airline's leaders saw it too. Vivian had already begun pulling strings at the top. Her influence reached far, into the boardrooms, the legal teams, the PR departments. The message was clear. This was no longer just an incident. It was a warning shot. Investigations would be opened, policies would be reviewed, accountability would no longer be optional. Vivian wasn't simply a passenger. She was a stakeholder, a change-maker, and now the driving force behind a transformation the airline could no longer ignore. She checked her phone once more as she waited for Maya to arrive. A new message blinked across the screen. Confirmation that her instructions had been received by the airline's executive office. Everything was in motion. Vivian had no interest in vengeance. This was about precedent. She was laying the foundation for something far bigger than a complaint. She was making sure this never happened again. Not to Maya, not to anyone. And she would use her voice and her power to make sure the entire industry took notice. When Maya finally reached the carousel, Vivian greeted her with a calm nod. "Ready?" she asked, her voice quiet but resolute. Maya met her mother's eyes and offered a faint, knowing smile. "I am." They didn't need to say more. As they moved together through the terminal, the buzz of the airport faded behind them. The energy between them was unspoken but strong. One woman fueled by purpose, the other by the quiet determination of knowing she'd been seen and valued. Vivian walked with intent, her steps deliberate. Maya mirrored her, composed, but now with a deeper fire behind her calm. She had felt it, that sting of judgment, the invisible line drawn around where she was told she didn't belong. But now, the ripple of that moment was beginning to spread. Vivian's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, then tucked it back into her purse. The message was confirmation. The internal review had officially been activated. Her earlier conversations with key decision-makers had already shifted the focus from a single incident to a cultural review of the airline's treatment of customers, especially those who didn't fit the expected profile. This was no longer about optics. It was about change. Vivian wasn't asking for an apology. She wasn't interested in public statements and hollow promises. She wanted lasting reform, and she knew exactly how to get it. She'd seen this pattern before. People in positions of power assuming they could define who belonged where, drawing conclusions in the blink of an eye, letting their biases go unchecked. But not this time. This time, Vivian was going to make sure the airline understood exactly what kind of mistake they had made, and exactly how deep the consequences would run. As they moved past security and headed toward the exit, Maya took a slow, steady breath. She had held it together through the flight. She hadn't let her anger show, but now, walking beside her mother, the weight of it hit a little differently. The situation was real. It had happened. And even though Maya was used to standing tall, the vulnerability of it lingered. the sting of being dismissed because of how she looked, how she carried herself, what others assumed she could or couldn't afford. But Vivian had never let Maya carry that burden alone. She had fought for years to dismantle those assumptions, in boardrooms, in banks, in backhanded conversations. And now, she was dismantling them in the sky. Outside the terminal, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The driver stepped out, nodding respectfully as he opened the door for them. Vivian entered first, her posture dignified, her presence undeniable. Maya followed, sliding into the seat beside her mother as the door closed behind them. This was no longer a reaction. This was a mission. The black car eased into city traffic, slipping away from Brighton Regional Airport as the skyline shimmered ahead of them. Inside the quiet cabin of the vehicle, Vivian Bennett sat poised, her phone in hand, her eyes briefly scanning the buildings as they passed. Beside her, Maya sat still, her gaze fixed out the window, lost in the reflection of all that had unfolded. No words passed between them. They didn't need any. The silence was full, heavy with purpose, understanding, and unspoken resolve. Vivian glanced over at her daughter. Maya's hand rested calmly in her lap, but her shoulders held a quiet strength. She wasn't just enduring, she was preparing. Vivian admired that. Maya didn't just experience injustice, she understood it, carried it, and now she was choosing to face it. They were no longer just mother and daughter. They were a team. Vivian's phone buzzed again, and she turned it over to read the message. The internal review, officially underway, and the CEO of the airline, he would be in touch soon. Vivian had been clear. This wouldn't end with a hollow apology or vague promises of doing better. She expected a personal meeting. She had no intention of letting this slide. The company wasn't just facing a PR problem. They were facing a reckoning, and Vivian would ensure it went far deeper than surface-level repair. As the car sped toward her downtown office, Vivian's mind moved ahead. This wasn't just about this airline. This moment could become the starting point for something bigger. A blueprint for how to confront implicit bias within entire industries. She had the reach, the voice, the momentum, and she wasn't going to waste it. Back at the airport, Denise Warren struggled to steady her breath as she was led into a quiet, windowless room just off the administrative wing. Her legs felt heavy. Her thoughts were tangled, a blur of dread and regret. She had walked into that plane with control. Now, she was being summoned like a child to the principal's office. Only this office held much higher stakes. Two executives entered a moment later. The man, middle-aged with a sharp suit and a sharper tone, introduced himself as part of the airline's internal review board. The woman beside him, dressed in business black with a clipboard in hand, offered no greeting, only a silent look that seemed to cut straight through Denise's defenses. This wasn't a conversation. It was an investigation. Denise sat down, her fingers nervously twisting together in her lap. Her voice trembled slightly as she attempted to explain. "I moved the passenger because I thought there was a mistake with her booking," she said. "She didn't look like she belonged in first class." The words left her mouth before she could soften them, and once they were out, they rang with an ugliness she couldn't take back. "You assumed," the woman cut in, her voice calm but unmistakably sharp. "You didn't verify with the system?" Denise hesitated, then admitted, "No, I didn't." There was a long pause. The man leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Do you know who this passenger is?" he asked. Denise shook her head. I "I didn't think it mattered," she stammered. "It does matter," the man said firmly. "That passenger is Maya Bennett, daughter of Vivian Bennett, one of this airline's largest private shareholders. She filed the formal complaint herself. And now, so has Ms. Bennett." The weight of his words landed hard. Vivian Bennett. Suddenly, it all made horrifying sense. Denise hadn't just embarrassed a young woman. She had insulted someone tied to the very core of the airline's ownership. Someone who had the power to rewrite policies, reshape leadership, and completely change the face of the company, if she wanted to. And Denise had given her every reason to do just that. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a disciplinary hearing. This was the beginning of a massive shift. And Denise was the unfortunate catalyst. The woman across the table began taking notes as the man continued speaking. "We're not just reviewing your conduct, Ms. Warren," he said. "We're reviewing the systems that allowed it to happen, and what role you played in exposing those flaws." Denise nodded weakly, her voice lost somewhere between fear and disbelief. She had walked onto that flight believing she had control. But Vivian Bennett? She had the power. And now the storm she set in motion was sweeping through every corridor of the airline. What had begun as a single judgment call was now unraveling into something far more serious. Denise Warren sat in the small, windowless conference room, her hands trembling, her throat dry. Just hours ago, she was confidently performing her usual routine. Now, she could barely meet the eyes of the executives seated across from her. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about the company, about the policies, about the bias she had exposed in a matter of minutes. She had always believed she was good at her job, reliable, quick to act, in control. But now, as the silence in the room grew heavier, she realized how badly she had misread everything. She hadn't followed procedure. She hadn't asked questions. She had made a decision based on nothing more than a gut feeling. A feeling shaped by years of assumptions, perhaps ones she had never even examined until now, and the fallout was just beginning. The executives weren't asking for excuses. They weren't even interested in why she had moved Maya Bennett out of first class. What mattered to them was how she did it, and what it revealed about the culture they had failed to address. The woman executive finally spoke again, her voice low but cutting. "You do understand this isn't just about one passenger being inconvenienced," she said. "This is about who we are as a company. The moment you made that call, you represented us. And what you demonstrated was bias. Clear, unchecked bias." Denise felt a lump forming in her throat. That word, bias, struck harder than she expected. She had never thought of herself that way. It wasn't personal. It wasn't malicious. It was just instinct. That's what she'd been telling herself. But now she saw the problem laid out before her in undeniable clarity. The man added quietly, "Do you know who Vivian Bennett is?" Denise blinked, then shook her head. "She's not just Maya's mother. She's a national leader in equity reform, a top investor, and one of the airline's most influential stakeholders. You didn't just move a passenger. You undermined everything this company claims to stand for." Denise's heart sank deeper into her chest. She had made the wrong call, and the cost of that mistake was now spiraling into places she could never have imagined. Not only had she misjudged a young woman, but she had inadvertently triggered a wave of scrutiny and reform that could reshape the airline itself. I didn't know," she whispered. The woman's gaze softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. It doesn't matter if you knew. What matters is what we do next. This isn't a one-off reprimand, Ms. Warren. This is now a matter of internal policy, of public accountability." The room fell silent again. Denise sat, numb. This was no longer about her job. This was about a system that had finally been forced to look at itself, and she had become the unwilling face of its failure. As the meeting wrapped up, Denise was quietly escorted out of the room. Her steps were heavy, uncertain. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear. Her role, as she knew it, was over. Across town, in her high-rise office overlooking the city, Vivian Bennett was preparing for her own meeting. The world outside her windows felt distant, the usual honking horns and office chatter fading into irrelevance. In this moment, everything narrowed into focus. This was about something far deeper than one flight or one employee's mistake. It was about how often this still happened, how frequently people were judged before being understood, how casually authority was used to put someone in their place. Vivian had faced it for decades, being underestimated, questioned, second-guessed, and now her daughter had too. But this time, she had the means to do something about it. Her phone buzzed again. An email from the airline's CEO. The meeting was confirmed. Soon, she would sit face-to-face with the man at the top, the one responsible for what this airline allowed and what it ignored. She hadn't expected the response to come so quickly, but it was clear the company understood the weight of the situation. They knew this wasn't just a PR issue, it was a culture issue. Vivian composed her reply with care, confirming the meeting time and expressing her expectations with firm, strategic language. There was no need to be aggressive. Her reputation alone spoke volumes. But she knew one thing. This wouldn't be a conversation. It would be a call to action. As the car curved through downtown, Maya Bennett gazed out the window in silence. The city lights flickered across the glass, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She could feel it. The shift. The change wasn't just in how people were responding, it was in her, and in her mother. Vivian Bennett had always been a strong presence in her life, resilient, fierce, strategic, but today Maya saw something even deeper. Not just a leader, but a force of nature who would stop at nothing to ensure justice reached everyone, not just those at the top. Vivian had fought for others before, but now Maya understood what that fight truly looked like, and just how high the stakes were. "Are you ready?" Vivian asked, her voice steady but edged with fire. Maya turned, met her mother's eyes and nodded. "I'm ready." Their car pulled up in front of the airline's corporate headquarters, a gleaming building of glass and stone. As it slowed to a stop, Vivian's hand hovered briefly over the door handle. She looked at Maya one last time. No words were needed. This was the moment. Inside, the CEO waited near the lobby entrance, dressed impeccably, his expression careful, a blend of corporate composure and visible discomfort. He extended his hand as Vivian stepped forward. "Ms. Bennett, it's a pleasure to meet you." Vivian accepted the handshake, but her gaze never wavered. "Let's get to the point," she said, her voice slicing through the air with composed authority. "This incident involving my daughter isn't just a personal grievance, it's a reflection of the culture you've allowed to fester in your organization, and that needs to change." The CEO gave a slow nod, already aware that this was not going to be a passive meeting. "We've launched an internal investigation," he said. "We take this very seriously." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly. "An internal investigation is a start," she replied. "But what I'm asking for goes beyond one flight attendant. What happened to Maya is not an isolated event. It's symptomatic of a much deeper issue in how your company trains, evaluates, and empowers its staff. I expect that to be addressed fully, starting now." The CEO shifted slightly, but didn't interrupt. Vivian continued. "I want a full policy review. I want mandatory sensitivity and anti-bias training implemented for every employee, from gate agents to pilots. And I want your leadership to understand that this kind of behavior is not negotiable. Not now, not ever." Maya sat beside her mother, silently absorbing every word. This wasn't just about justice. It was about building something new, a system where others like her wouldn't be questioned, doubted, or dismissed because of how they looked. And with every word Vivian spoke, Maya realized the power of speaking truth not through outrage, but through strategy. The CEO finally responded, his voice lower, less sure of itself. "We'll implement everything you've asked," he said. "The board has already approved initial changes, and I'll personally oversee their execution." Vivian didn't smile. She didn't need to. She had made her point, and now she was here to push for results. This wasn't about her daughter anymore. It was about every person who had ever been told, silently or loudly, "You don't belong here." The days that followed passed in a whirlwind. Vivian worked with relentless focus, overseeing the rollout of new initiatives. The airline's board moved quickly, ratifying changes and expanding their scope. A full training program was developed, targeting not just frontline staff but senior leadership as well. Every new policy carried the weight of what had happened. Every meeting, every memo, every directive, they were all now part of a larger reckoning, and Vivian was at the center of it. The CEO, once cautious and guarded, now called regularly with updates. His voice had changed, no longer dismissive, but deferential. He had come to understand the magnitude of the moment. Vivian wasn't just a concerned parent. She was a force reshaping the future of his company, and she wasn't backing down. Still, even as progress was made, Vivian knew change didn't end with a signed policy or a public statement. The real transformation would take time, and it would require vigilance, because systems don't heal overnight. But this was the beginning. As days passed and the dust from the incident began to settle, Vivian Bennett found herself reflecting not just on what had happened, but on how easily it had happened. The decision by Denise Warren to remove Maya from first class had been made in seconds. No questions, no facts, just a gut feeling, just bias dressed as procedure. And the scariest part? It wasn't rare, it was common. All too common in every industry, where people were judged before they ever spoke, dismissed before they were given the chance to belong. Vivian knew she had won a battle, but the fight, that was far from over. For Maya, things were quieter now. Less meetings, less calls, but no less important. Watching her mother work had changed something inside her. Maya had always admired Vivian's strength, but now she saw it with new eyes. The endless planning, the careful language, the controlled fire it took to demand systemic change and make it stick. It wasn't just power, it was discipline. Vivian hadn't just stood up for her daughter. She had stood up for every single person who had ever been told, in ways big or small, "You don't belong here." Maya now understood. This wasn't just about her story. It was about building a future where girls like her wouldn't need someone to defend their presence, because their place would never be questioned in the first place, and her mother had just cracked open the door to that future. The changes at the airline were finally taking form. The executive team had laid out a full timeline for their cultural overhaul. It wasn't just about retraining flight attendants. It was everyone. Gate agents, pilots, customer service reps, corporate managers. No one was exempt. The ripple was spreading, not just from a boardroom or a press release, but from the determination of one woman who refused to let the moment pass. Vivian watched every step with sharp focus. Not only was she a key shareholder, but she had become something more, an active architect of change, and she wasn't going to let this opportunity slip away. The momentum was too real, the stakes too high. When Maya boarded her next flight, this time again alongside her mother, she noticed it. The shift. No double takes, no curious stares, no quiet whispers. The staff greeted her respectfully, professionally, as they did every other passenger. There was no hesitation, just courtesy. It was a small change, but to Maya it felt huge, and she knew exactly why it had happened. Vivian's work was already leaving its mark. The culture was beginning to turn, not just in policy, but in presence, in the way people carried themselves, the way they interacted, the way they saw others. Maya had always been proud of her mother, but now she saw her as more than strong. She saw her as transformational. Vivian had stared down a system and said, "You will do better." And the system listened. In the days that followed, Vivian's phone never seemed to stop buzzing. This time, the message came from the airline's HR department. The first round of mandatory sensitivity training had been officially scheduled. She read it, nodded quietly to herself, and allowed the smallest smile. It wasn't everything, but it was a start, a real start, because change takes time, and it takes repetition. But it also takes someone refusing to let it fade when the headlines do. Vivian wasn't working alone either. The other passengers who had witnessed what happened that day, the ones who had sat in silence, some of them had reached out. Their voices joined hers, confirming the truth of the experience and demanding that their airline become something better. The ripple was growing. The training sessions rolled out in waves, workshops built around implicit bias, cultural awareness, and the power of inclusivity. Employees from every department attended, some reluctantly, some curiously, but all of them left different. Because once you've seen how easily harm can happen, you begin to ask, how can I prevent it? It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination anymore. It was about building a company where every person, regardless of their skin, their hair, their walk, or their accent, felt seen and valued, on purpose. Vivian kept close watch over every phase. She knew this wasn't the finish line. Far from it. It was just one piece of a much bigger puzzle, but it was also the most important thing she'd accomplished in a long time, and she wasn't done yet. Vivian Bennett had always known that if change was going to last, it had to be woven into the very fabric of the company's culture, not as a reaction, but as a commitment. And now, those threads were being carefully stitched. Future generations of airline staff and passengers would know the difference. They would feel it. Because Vivian had made sure the kind of quiet prejudice that had almost stripped her daughter of her dignity would no longer be tolerated. But Vivian wasn't alone anymore. Maya had stepped forward too. At first, she had only watched, observed her mother's strategies and leadership from the sidelines. But as the weeks passed and policy meetings became a regular occurrence, Maya began speaking up, offering her perspective as the person it had happened to. She had never seen herself as an advocate, but now she was becoming one. What began as a painful memory was turning into purpose. Maya understood now that her voice carried weight, not just as the daughter of a powerful woman, but as someone who had lived the experience. She didn't want anyone else to go through what she had endured, and so she spoke, clearly, calmly, with intention. As final revisions to the airline's new anti-discrimination policies were being put into place, Maya and Vivian found themselves back in the corporate office, seated across from the CEO and several key executives. This time, the atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no defensiveness. There was respect. Vivian had made certain that these changes weren't just temporary fixes to quiet the media. They were becoming permanent, rooted in training systems, performance reviews, and company-wide values. She had demanded accountability, and she had received it. "It's been a long road," Vivian said, her voice strong but composed. "But we've made progress. And this," she gestured to the table between them, "is no longer just about my daughter. It's about creating a culture of respect for every single passenger who walks through your gates." The CEO nodded, his tone far more sincere than the one he had used weeks before. "We understand," he said, "and we're committed to honoring the work you've helped us begin. You've changed this airline." Vivian gave a quiet smile, the kind that didn't need applause. "This is only the beginning," she replied. "I'll be watching to make sure what we've started here doesn't fade when the headlines do. Real change isn't a one-time fix." Maya looked over at her mother with pride shining in her eyes. She knew the fight wasn't over, not even close. But this moment, this was a victory. And for the first time, Maya felt a peaceful certainty settle into her chest. She had been part of something bigger than herself, something that would last. And she knew now, without question, that her mother's influence would continue shaping the future, not just for her, but for everyone who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The story of what had happened aboard Flight 832 didn't stay confined to the walls of the airline for long. News outlets picked up the story. Articles were written. Podcasts discussed it. The headlines praised Vivian Bennett's role in driving systemic change. Her poise, her persistence, her refusal to accept performative apologies, it all became a blueprint for what true corporate accountability could look like. The incident had ignited a larger conversation about racial bias, workplace discrimination, and the critical need for representation in leadership roles. Vivian had become a symbol of that change. But for Maya, the media attention came with mixed emotions. She was proud of the movement her mother had helped create. She was grateful that the issue was getting attention. But for her, this wasn't just a story. It was personal. It was hers. Maya remembered how it felt to walk down that aisle under 1,000 judgmental eyes. How it felt to be asked to move, not because of a mistake, but because of an assumption. And while the world now saw the broader implications, Maya still carried the sting of that moment in her bones. Vivian, however, understood something that her daughter was still learning. The personal is always political. What had happened to Maya didn't just affect her. It exposed a culture, one that had been allowed to go unchecked for far too long. And now, it was time to dismantle that culture. Call after call began flooding in, from law firms, nonprofits, tech companies, even universities. Leaders from across sectors were reaching out, eager to partner with Vivian on diversity training initiatives, cultural sensitivity programs, and policy reform consultations. The impact was already stretching beyond the airline industry. Vivian wasn't interested in praise or attention. She wasn't chasing the spotlight. What mattered most to her was making sure the changes stuck, so that the next time someone like Maya boarded a flight, there would be no reason to doubt her place in that seat. Vivian's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the airline's leadership team. The message from the legal team was clear. The review was complete. Vivian Bennett looked up from her screen at Maya, seated across from her in their office, the same place where plans had once been scribbled in notebooks and whispered over late-night calls. "It's done," Vivian said softly, though her eyes were glowing with quiet triumph. "The new policies are officially approved." Maya leaned back in her chair, her heart full. She had been a part of something important, something that would reach far beyond that single flight. It would shape lives, shift norms, redefine what leadership looked like. And as they walked out of the office, side by side, ready to face what came next, Maya no longer felt like she was simply her mother's daughter. She was part of the force that was changing the world. A few months later, the effects of their work became visible in ways big and small. The airline was no longer the same. Passengers were treated with more respect. Flight attendants were noticeably more mindful, not just polite, but aware. The whispering stares that once trailed Maya through the aisles had vanished. Now, when she boarded, there were nods, smiles, even quiet admiration. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress. Vivian continued her work, regularly checking in with the airline's executive team to ensure the training programs weren't fading into background noise. She wanted results, not rehearsed responses, and she was seeing them. Slowly, other companies took notice. She began receiving invitations, conferences, panels, strategy sessions, all asking her to speak about inclusive leadership, cultural accountability, and what it meant to turn a moment of injustice into a lasting movement. Maya, too, had stepped into a new role. No longer just the face of a viral story, she had become an advocate in her own right. She joined her mother at speaking engagements, sharing her perspective, the pain, the anger, the resilience. Her voice wasn't just powerful, it was needed. One afternoon, as they prepared to speak at another leadership summit, Maya glanced at her mother, her voice quiet. "Do you think things will ever be perfect?" she asked. Vivian gave a soft smile, eyes shining with earned wisdom. "Perfection?" she echoed. "That's a long way off. But progress is what we fight for, and that's something we can always strive toward." Maya nodded slowly, the truth of the words settling into her spirit. They were still fighting, and would be for a long time. But they were winning. Together, they had shifted the air around them. And with each step forward, they were reshaping the world into one where belonging wasn't questioned. It was assumed. Months passed since that now famous flight. But the transformation at the airline wasn't fading. It was deepening. Vivian had become an unofficial advisor to the company's board. Her insights weren't just welcomed, they were sought after. Diversity training wasn't a one-time event anymore. It had become a pillar of the airline's operations. What had begun as one woman's quiet resistance had evolved into a cultural blueprint for change. Vivian remained proud, but cautious. She had seen what happened in other companies when momentum slowed, when the news cycles moved on, when people stopped watching. One mistake, one bad decision, and the entire system could begin to crumble again. That's why she stayed involved, not as a passenger, but as a guardian, making sure that respect, dignity, and fairness were more than slogans, that they were practiced by every hand, every face, every voice in the company. And Maya, she had stepped up too, not just as Vivian's daughter, but as a powerful, articulate presence in her own right, standing for fairness, for dignity, and for a future where others like her never had to prove they belonged. Then, one day, the call came. Vivian answered, expecting another check-in. But it wasn't that. It was the airline's CEO. Another airline, a major international carrier, had reached out to them. They wanted help. They wanted to adopt the same changes, the same training, the same model that Vivian had pioneered. As she listened, something in her chest stirred, a quiet, rising feeling she hadn't expected. This was the breakthrough. What had begun as a mother defending her daughter's right to dignity was now becoming a template for transformation across an entire industry. The changes Vivian Bennett had fought so hard to implement were no longer confined to a single airline. They were spreading, company by company, industry by industry. Her efforts had become more than just policy. They had become proof that transformation was possible when people in power refused to stay silent. Still, Vivian knew her work wasn't over. It never would be. The ripple effect she had helped ignite was reaching unexpected corners. Requests came in almost daily now. Invitations to speak on panels, participate in roundtables, lead sessions on systemic change. From tech firms to financial institutions to education networks, leaders across the country were reaching out. They wanted to know what Vivian Bennett knew. They wanted to learn how she did it. And quietly, steadily, another powerful voice was rising alongside her. Maya. Once hesitant to step into the spotlight, she now moved through it with growing confidence. She had seen her mother work tirelessly. Yes, but more than that, she had felt the difference those changes were making. She had lived them. Now, Maya was stepping into her own story, not as a symbol, but as a speaker, someone with hard-won experience and a clear vision for a better future. At a leadership conference in Chicago, Maya found herself seated at a table of young professionals. They were candidly discussing their workplace challenges, their frustrations with being overlooked, their dreams of building inclusive cultures. And then the topic turned to diversity. Maya hesitated only for a moment, and then she spoke. She shared her story, the flight, the humiliation, her mother's quiet strategy, the ripple effect that followed, the people who listened, the ones who didn't. The room grew still, and when she finished, the nods were immediate. A few offered their thanks. Others looked visibly moved. Maya realized something she hadn't before. They needed to hear this. They needed to believe that one person, or two, together, could change an entire company, that their stories mattered, and that silence wasn't the only option. From the back of the room, Vivian watched with pride as Maya carried the torch forward. Her daughter's voice was clear, her message unshakable. Vivian had always known Maya would change the world, but seeing it happen right in front of her only deepened her resolve. The foundation they had built was solid, but Maya was the one beginning to build the house. Back at the airline, the ripple turned into a wave. It wasn't just the policies anymore. It was the way people spoke about the company. Flight attendants greeted passengers with kindness. Gate agents were more attentive. Even pilots took the time to acknowledge passengers with warmth and respect. Social media filled with positive posts. Stories about exceptional service, thoughtful interactions, small moments that added up to a massive shift in culture. People weren't just flying the airline, they were feeling seen by it. Then, during a routine executive meeting, Vivian received a call. It was a close friend in the industry, someone who had been watching the airline's transformation closely. "Vivian," the voice on the other end said, breathless with excitement, "you're not going to believe this." She paused. "There's a report coming out tomorrow from a national consumer watchdog. Your airline has been named one of the top companies in the country for workplace inclusivity and bias reduction." Vivian sat in stunned silence for a moment. And then she felt it. Not pride, not victory, but something deeper. Fulfillment. All the planning, the pushing, the quiet insistence that things had to be better. It had paid off. Just then, her phone buzzed again. It was a text from Maya. "We're doing it, Mom. We're making a difference." Vivian closed her eyes for a second, letting the moment settle. She had always wanted to leave a mark on the world. She hadn't expected it to look like this, not from one small injustice, but now she could see the scale of what they had built. Together, mother and daughter, not just correcting a wrong, but lighting a path for others to follow. The airline was no longer just an airline. It was a model, a case study in what could happen when people stopped waiting for change and started demanding it. Vivian wasn't going to let the momentum fade. She had started with one mistake from one flight attendant, and now she was helping to reshape an entire industry's future. And Maya, she was no longer just reacting. She was leading. Despite the incredible strides Vivian Bennett had helped the airline make, she never lost sight of a simple truth. The world outside their progress bubble still carried old habits. There were still places where people were judged by how they looked, where glances became assumptions, where assumptions dictated power. And that wasn't something that would change overnight. But Vivian, at her core, had always been an optimist. She understood that change came slowly, that there would be setbacks, missteps, and moments when it felt like the world was sliding backward. But she also knew something else. If you keep pushing forward, you do make a difference. The airline's new culture of inclusivity was just a single flame in what had become a growing fire across industries. Companies around the world were watching, adapting, reaching out for guidance. Every time Vivian led a training session, every time she shared her story on a stage, every time she sat across a boardroom table urging change with quiet resolve, she saw something remarkable happening. People were listening. They were learning. Lives were being changed, one conversation at a time. And right beside her, Maya had come into her own. No longer the quiet daughter unsure of how to step into the world, she was now a voice that resonated across generations. Her story, and the courage with which she told it, had empowered others to speak out. She had become a beacon. Her voice mattered, and she knew it. She was using that voice to make sure no one else would ever have to feel the humiliation she had once endured. Not on a plane, not in a boardroom, not anywhere. One evening, the two women sat together in the cozy warmth of their living room. The city lights sparkled just outside the windows. Their lives, once shaken by a single incident at 30,000 feet, had expanded into something neither of them could have imagined. "We're not done yet," Vivian said, her voice calm but steady, her gaze settled on her daughter. "There's still so much to do." Maya nodded, her eyes clear, determined. "We've started something big, Mom," she replied, "and it's only the beginning. The years that followed only deepened their impact." The airline Vivian had helped transform became a model for the entire industry. Its commitment to diversity and inclusion wasn't just surface level, it had become part of its very identity. It was frequently cited in reports, conferences, even academic studies as an example of what true corporate change could look like. But more than that, Vivian's influence began to stretch far beyond the airline. She became a mentor, a strategist, a respected voice in circles that once resisted transformation. She didn't just open doors, she held them open. Maya continued her work as an advocate, growing in power and presence. With every passing year, she became more than a symbol of change. She became a leader of it. Together, the mother-daughter duo had become synonymous with the fight for equity. And all of it had started with one unjust moment, one assumption, one person who thought Maya didn't belong. Now, she stood on the very stage they said wasn't hers to stand on. At a major global summit on workplace diversity, Maya took the stage. The audience, a sea of executives, students, activists, and dreamers, leaned in. She spoke not just of policy, but of pain, of growth, of legacy. She shared how one flight attendant's biased judgment had triggered a revolution in her life. How her mother had turned quiet strategy into a sweeping transformation. How change, when pursued with persistence, was not only possible, it was inevitable. It's not just about changing policies, Maya said, her voice rising with conviction. It's about changing hearts and minds. It's about making sure that everyone, no matter what they look like, where they come from, or what they believe, knows that they belong. The room erupted in applause. At the back, Vivian stood with her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm but radiant with pride. This had never just been about one flight. It was about creating a world where everyone could thrive. Together, they had proven something the world desperately needed to hear. Real change doesn't begin in boardrooms. It begins with a choice, a voice, a moment when someone decides that enough is enough, and when people stand up and speak up with truth and courage. That moment can transform not just one life, but the lives of thousands. Together, Vivian and Maya had shown the world that when the fight is just and the hearts are ready, the sky is no longer the limit. It's only the beginning.